My name is Keith Townsend. I'm a candidate for the North Carolina State House in District 77. I think many Americans would agree with me when I say that slavery is the original sin of this nation. We have paid a horrendous price for it throughout this nation's history. I think many in the white community, and I hate to say I felt this way myself at one time, when they look at slavery, they all feel it was a terrible thing, but they also think, how am I responsible for that? Slavery took place, in my case, almost 90 years. It ended almost 90 years before I was born. So how could I have any responsibility for something in which I didn't even exist? And I think there's there's a logic behind that that's hard to refute. But what we're facing today is not a question of slavery itself, but the consequences of slavery. If you look back at the history of the time, when slavery ended, it was replaced almost immediately in the southern states by what we call the Black Codes. The Black Codes, for all intents and purposes, were a form of, they weren't called that, but it was a form of slavery. There was a period where the federal government, we all know it as Reconstruction, they were in the South. They tried to maintain some kind of peace and order. But even during Reconstruction, there was very little safety, very little protection for African American communities. And eventually, the federal government washed their hands of the whole thing. They'd been here for nearly a decade, and they said, we're going to turn it over to those of you in the South, leaders in the South, to do what they will with the racial situation. And so what happened immediately almost is what we refer to today as the Jim Crow system. And Jim Crow is nothing other than a form of apartheid. And I guess I'm showing my age, but I was born during the end of the Jim Crow system. And I remember as a child in Greensboro, I was 8 years old in 1960, when they had the famous sit-in protest at Woolworths downtown. And I went down there with my father. He took me down, not to see the protest, but we saw the television trucks and all the hoopla that was going on around, all the media attention that was going on. And I do have a memory of that. And since then, as we know, the racial problems haven't evaporated, or we've seen what's been going on this summer. But the thing that is probably the most pervasive, and has been for years, is the economic racism. And Martin Luther King, when he was just before he was assassinated in Memphis, he went to Memphis to support sanitation workers in a strike. He stated over and over again that until we have economic justice, we can't have racial justice. And that has proved to be true. And North Carolina today, the average African American family has 1/16 of the wealth of the average white family in this state. And it's because, essentially, of what we call generational wealth. Because of redlining in the housing, lack of good paying jobs, and the many factors, the African American community simply hasn't had the wealth to pass on to their children. And this is a factor that's still with it and really hasn't changed over the last 20 or 25 years. Those statistics have stayed pretty much the same. And, when you bring up, the term has come up probably in the last 4 or 5 years, white privilege. If you bring that term up with people, they immediately, not everyone, but a lot of white people will become offended by it and defensive about it. And I want to give you an example of what I think this might mean. My father grew up in Winston-Salem in an orphanage, and went in as an infant, 18 months old, and left to go fight in World War II. He was in the Navy. And when he got home from the service, came back to North Carolina, the Congress had passed what maybe one of the great pieces of legislation that's ever been passed in American history, and that's the GI Bill. And the GI Bill, as it was written, originally, before it hit the floor to be amended, was meant for all military servicemen and women. Didn't matter who they were, what race they were, but when it got on the floor of the Congress, it was the Southern, and I hate to say, Southern Democrats were the basic people behind this maneuver, said that the benefits from this bill should be determined state by state. And so they turned the benefits over to each state government to make a decision, and you can imagine what happened then. For the most part, there were some exceptions, but for the most part, the GI Bill was denied to African Americans. So my father came home from the war, didn't really have resources to go on and get an education, but the GI Bill paid for him to go to NC State. And he was able to get a degree. He made a good life for his family. We weren't wealthy, but I lived a comfortable childhood. I didn't want for food or shelter. And you ask yourself, obviously it changed my father's life dramatically, but it changed my life dramatically. So much of what I've had and have taken for granted all my life may not have been there for me except for this. And that's an example, and sometimes it's hard to see, but that's an example, I think, of what people mean when they say white privilege. It does exist. I know it's existed in my life. And until America is willing to face these racial facts, I believe, this problem this issue will be with us for generations to come, and it's not fair to pass this on to our children and our grandchildren. We can begin to stand up, face it, and try to do something about it to make it better. My name is Keith Townsend. I am a House candidate for District 77 in the North Carolina House. Thank you.